What is your worst Bridezilla story? I used to be a bridal consultant at a retail store, which basically means I helped couples scan things onto their registry. The training for it just meant I knew how to use the scanner and the computer, and my actual job had nothing to do with bridal shopping. This one couple came in to start a new registry, which quickly turned into only things the bride wanted. Anything the groom wanted to put down on the registry was deemed as childish, stupid, ugly, unpractical, never going to be used. I was cringing during the entire appointment. She kept asking for my opinion on everything, and I felt so bad for this guy. His bride-to-be seemed so selfish and entitled. The poor man just wanted a waffle maker. I'm a florist. We had a bride and her mother show up at 9 a.m. They wanted to order a bridal bouquet, a mother of the bride Cattleya orchid corsage, a boutonniere for the groom, and 6 smaller ones for the groomsmen. The wedding was scheduled for noon. Yep, 3 hours from then, and they wanted them ready by the time they were done with their makeup appointment at the beauty parlor a few doors down. The bride was flipping through the sample book and pointing out the style and flowers she wanted. Think garden roses with long, sweeping trails of stephanotis and variegated ivy, all 3 of which would require at least a week's advanced order with our suppliers. She was absolutely gobsmacked that we didn't carry extremely expensive and highly perishable flowers at all times. My boss told them that since they didn't place an order beforehand, they would be limited to what we had in stock and simple styles that could be assembled quickly. The bride and her mom kept pointing at the book and arguing that we should have those specific flowers in stock. My boss eventually took the book off the desk and tossed it behind the counter. The bride vacillated between tears and petulant whining that we were going to ruin her big day. My boss, who had a bone-deep loathing for brides in general, told her she had ruined her own day by not ordering her flowers before her actual wedding day. The mom tried chewing out my boss for her lack of customer service skills. My boss told her that she was welcome to go down the street to Vaughn's and ask their flower department to make their order with whatever they had in stock. The mom said she'd do just that and reassured the bride that she'd have her flowers done by the time her appointment was over. Both women stormed out. I figured that was that. But my boss told me and another girl to start on 6 simple dendrobium orchid boots. Meanwhile, she threw together a ribbon-wrapped bridal bouquet with some white roses that were nearly past their prime and some more dendros. Sure enough, 20 minutes later, the mother of the bride slunk back in and meekly asked if we were still able to assemble what they needed. We did. We also charged her a very large bitch tax, rush fee. I worked at a hotel where we were hosting a wedding party. The bride called the front desk guy a to his face. He asked her to apologize. She doubled down and told him, "I don't apologize to no." So he went and got a manager to talk to them. Well, this bride apparently hates a lot of people because she tripled down at this point saying, "Why are they sending some to talk to me?" We canceled their room block and the atrium they had reserved for their ceremony and reception with no refund, which they tried complaining and yelling at us about, but we didn't flip. From the gossip I heard, they ended up having the ceremony at a courthouse and the reception ended up being at a Hooters kind of place because it was the only place with space available. My mom and I saw a great Bridezilla freak out while shopping for my own wedding dress a few years back. We were in a small local shop when another mother-daughter duo came in. The attendant who had been helping us went up to greet them. The mother said they were here to pick up her daughter's dress, so the attendant looks her name up on the computer, frowns, and says, "Ma'am, you never bought the dress." "What are you talking about?" The attendant shows the lady the notes on her computer screen. "You said you wanted to think about it, and asked if we could hold the dress. We held it for 2 weeks, but when we didn't hear back from you, we assumed you didn't want it." "Well, we want it now." "It's been over 8 months, the attendant explained. "We sold the dress a long time ago, but I can order you another one and have it expedited here in a few weeks." And like a Mount St. Helens of entitlement, the eruption began. "This is unacceptable," the mother shrieked. "We have her alterations scheduled in 2 hours. The wedding is a week away. I can't believe you sold her dress." The bride, meanwhile, is slumped against the desk and sobbing like someone killed her dog. My mom and I are just open-mouthed staring at this point. The attendant was trying to be diplomatic, but is clearly as baffled as we are. "Ma'am, we had no way to know you wanted it. You never called. You never put down a deposit. The dress isn't yours until you pay for it." After some more screaming from the mother and wailing from the bride, they left. The shop attendant came back over to us and I asked her, Does that kind of thing happen a lot? The poor lady just deflated. All the time. I was at the wedding of an ex-boyfriend several years ago. He had planned and practiced singing a Frank Sinatra song to his new wife. He went up, took the mic, and with the band backing him up, began singing the song. His new wife suddenly stomped across the dance floor, went up on the stage, grabbed the mic from him, and said, "I hate that f***ing song and I don't want to hear it." They were divorced about a year later. My experience with a bridezilla happened at my great-aunt's house. She has a private lake and a lovely setup for a small country-style outdoor wedding. The mother of the groom was a close friend of hers, so my aunt was happy to open up her home for the event. I got the feeling leading up to the wedding that the groom's family didn't care much for the bride. After witnessing her throwing a temper tantrum over the placement of the food table because it started to rain, I started to see why. Listening to the way she talked to everyone around her appalled me. She was a complete spoiled brat, and was really lucky that everyone didn't just leave the wedding completely. I wouldn't have blamed them a bit. However, the worst was the fact that she decided that she wanted her bridesmaids to walk barefoot in the muddy, wet grass, after she had them buy new boots to wear specifically with their dresses. Anyone who has ever bought cowboy boots knows that they are upwards of $100, and she picked out pink ones to match their pink dresses. All 5 of the bridesmaids had to buy these boots on top of whatever they had to pay for the dress, and she decides 10 minutes before the wedding starts that she doesn't want them to wear them. Of course, everyone complies and pacifies her, and the wedding goes well, although it got pretty tense during the speak now or forever hold your peace part. I'm not surprised to hear that the marriage didn't make it to 6 months. She was the most selfish person I've ever met. I'm convinced that she didn't want to get married at all, just wanted all the attention on her. I was the DJ for a wedding where the bride, from a very wealthy family, was not expected to live past childhood. Imagine a girl who was raised having never heard the word no. Her entire childhood was one big make-a-wish. She had a zest for life. She loved to dance, so much so that her parents built her a giant lake house with a ballroom, but more like a disco club. She was marrying a man several years her senior, whom she met at a dance class. He was just like a character out of a movie that charms older women and then steals their fortunes, except this was a much younger woman. After dinner, and I've done this hundreds of times, dancing starts. The request list for the wedding reception was a lot of early 90s high-energy dance music. I decided to kick off dancing with the bride's favorite song, Pump Up the Jam by Technotronic. Until this moment, I had nothing but pleasant interactions with this woman who genuinely seemed to appreciate life for how precious it truly is. Before the beat could even drop, she was running over to me screaming, tearing into me for ruining her wedding. It was a spectacle, and the guests watched in horror as she berated me. She wasn't ready to dance yet, and I was playing the song that she was most looking forward to dancing to on her wedding day. I was forced to stop the song cold, and the only sound was her screaming as I fumbled to find some cocktail music to throw on until she was ready to dance. At the end of the night, her father came up and gave me a $400 gratuity. He offered a simple apology, but you could tell they carried the weight of the monster he'd created. I worked as a wedding planner and coordinator. One bride stands out to me. She was a complete sweetheart during the planning phase, and I never saw any of the crazy until the day of the wedding. It was honestly like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde moment. She wanted a big wedding, around 300 people, and spent a lot of money on the venue and food and wanted the best for everything. No complaints about paying for it either. Never asked for discounts or anything like that. And since she wanted the best and seemed to have a really large budget, I referred her to a popular baker for the cake. I let her handle the logistics for the cake since I've worked with this baker before and never had any problems. I figured they would do the standard cake tasting, pick a design with the baker, and I would see a gorgeous masterpiece on the day of the wedding. Well, that didn't really work out. For some reason, she didn't want to tell the baker that it was for a wedding. I'm guessing she read that you can save money by ordering a regular cake, because some vendors will automatically add an extra charge if it's for a wedding. By the way, this is true to some extent, but the extra charge truly is there for a reason. Whenever something is for a wedding, the vendor puts in much more care than usual, and oftentimes will go all out and use premium materials or add upgrades. Not all of us are just adding extra charges for no reason. Anyways, She decided she didn't want to pay for a wedding cake, so she told the baker it was for a birthday party. The baker asked how many people the cake would need to serve, and she said around 50. She also didn't want to pay the delivery fee, so she had her sister pick up the cake on the morning of the wedding and bring it to the event. It's important to mention that we live in Texas and this is a summer wedding. By the time the cake got to the venue, about 6 hours after it was picked up from the bakery, it didn't look all that great anymore. Some of the decorations had melted. The cake got a little banged up in the car ride. There was icing on the inside of the box, and the entire cake was sagging on one side. I saw it, and it looked like a complete disaster. At this point, we're about an hour away from the start of the wedding, and there's no possible way to fix this. The bride comes into the reception room with her makeup all done, sees the cake, and completely flips out. Screaming, crying, throwing things, collapsing on the floor, complete meltdown. She threatens to cancel the whole wedding if we don't fix it. We try to calm her down as much as we can and grab the makeup artist before she leaves and ask if she can help fix the bride's makeup, which is a mess now. The bride sees herself in the mirror and has another meltdown because she ruined her hair and makeup and now wants to have the whole thing redone. After she gets everything done to perfection again, we're about an hour behind schedule. I let the guests come inside the reception room to wait because it seemed cruel to force everyone to sit outside in 100-degree heat. But when she saw that everyone was inside, she had another meltdown. She spent the entire wedding sulking with a scowl on her face and refused to take any pictures with people. Her new husband kept coming over to hug her and try to cheer her up, but she would either yell at him or give him the silent treatment. Most of the guests left very early because the atmosphere felt so uncomfortable. Pretty much a waste of the $200,000 budget for a lavish wedding, all because she wanted to save a couple $100 on the cake. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Guys who married Bridezillas, what happened after the wedding? My first wife was a Bridezilla. During the honeymoon, she realized she was married, and the wedding day was history. She wanted the big wedding, which she had, not the marriage. The next 2 years were hell until she finally tapped out. I was young and stupid, and the thought of divorce never crossed my mind. I don't know why it didn't. I guess I just assumed I'd be miserable for the rest of my life. When she told me she was leaving, it felt as if the weight of the world was off of my shoulders. On a happy note, her parents were still paying off the wedding when we divorced. That's what happens when you allow your daughter everything she wants, including 2 wedding dresses. My ex-wife was a Bridezilla, and her mother was the definition of a monster-in-law. I just handed over the reins in defeat and got drunk or stoned through the whole planning process, which ended up being the complete opposite of anything that I wanted. The marriage lasted 2 years, 7 months, and 3 days. My group of friends, including my best man, his wife, a few colleagues, and my sister, had a betting pool on how long the marriage would last. I found this out the day I told my father, who was also in on it, that we had separated. At the time, I put it down to the stress of wedding planning and thought she was not really like this. Nope. Turns out that she is a spoiled brat and wanted me to take over from her father, just pampering her and never saying no because he said that now she's married. It was my responsibility to maintain the life she was used to. She ended up leaving me while I was deployed, moved interstate, and took my son. That was a shock to come home to an empty house. Her reasoning? I said no to her buying a new vacuum and that I didn't love my family enough because I put my work first. 4 years later, after a long and messy divorce, I am about to elope to Vegas with my partner as we are happier than ever together, and neither of us wants to deal with the BS associated with a traditional wedding. My ex-wife was extremely cranky and yelling at everyone all day because things weren't perfect. The funny thing is, her behavior was causing a lot of stuff to not be perfect. The straw that broke the camel's back was when she threw a beer bottle at the DJ's head when he played a song she didn't like. Our marriage only lasted a year. I married a Bridezilla. In the 18 months we were married, she was such an unfit mother, too many instances to list here, that when the divorce was finalized, I got custody of our kid and the kid she had before our marriage. Also, she was a blackout drinker and cheated on me with several different men. The final straw was when I had to travel out of state to check on my grandmother. I came back a day early, saw used Marlboros in the ashtray, not her brand, plus I don't smoke, and then I heard grunting and groaning in the bedroom. Yep, there she was. And there he was. And there he was, doing the devil's triangle. I contacted a divorce lawyer the next day and finalized it as fast as possible. We got married a couple of years out of college in a part of the US where big fancy weddings are the norm. It was a while ago, but here are a few things I remember off the top of my head. She handpicked my groomsmen and ushers, excluding my lifelong best friend. I don't think he specifically offended her, but his personality just rubbed her wrong. She brushed me off when I told her how I felt about it by saying, "I'm sorry you got upset about that." She pulled me out of an engagement party by my ear, in front of other people, for not standing next to her the entire time. She demanded my parents host the rehearsal dinner at the venue of her choosing, was told no, and said she wouldn't enjoy it since they chose not to move it. She saw some trendy alternative to a groom's cake on a blog or something, and decided I had to have it, so she fought my mom about that too. Her mother was going on and on about wanting to invite this person and that person. I finally told her that I would allow her to have exactly the same number of invites that my parents requested. That made her happy, until I told her their number, 8. The wedding was in her area, far from where my folks lived. She complained and complained because she had told all her friends and church people that they would be getting invites. All of this gave me a nagging gut feeling that something was wrong, but I pressed on against my better judgment. The wedding turned out to be awesome, but I was definitely nervous drinking the whole time and thought, what the hell had I gotten myself into? Turns out that wasn't just her stressing about details. She was like that for the next 4 years until the marriage ended in divorce. I married a bridezilla. We're talking about costume changes between the wedding and reception, yelling at the wedding planner, all-night fights about whether we can add fruit kebabs so people would maybe get enough to eat and all that. There was zero compromise. Turns out no compromise at the wedding meant no compromise anywhere else. So, we got a divorce after 4 years of marriage. Best decision ever. She left me 3 months later. After the wedding and vacation were over, I told her we needed to pay the debt we just accumulated. She said she didn't have much on her credit card and could pay it off in a couple of months if I picked up some of her bills. I stupidly agreed. A few months later, she had her credit card paid off. Then she told me she wanted a divorce. We had a budget for the wedding and should have had no debt at the end, but in the last few weeks before the wedding, she suddenly had to spend a ton of money on wedding nonsense I had never even heard of before. And when I say she spent a ton of money, it all came out of my pocket. My first marriage was to a bridezilla. She got wasted before the ceremony and wouldn't dance because she was too anxious people would make fun of her. She bragged to my cousins during the dinner that our wedding was better than theirs and invited her ex-boyfriend to the ceremony. I later found out she had been sleeping with him before and after our wedding. The list goes on. She took the money we received as gifts and spent it on a bunch of random stuff when we were planning on using it for a house down payment. She also had a ton of debt she kept from me and kept spending money more quickly than she could make it. I ended up having to take on a second job to cover the bills even though I already worked over 50 hours a week. Eventually, she stopped going to work. She'd go visit her friend in the evenings, but it turned out she was meeting her ex. The final straw was when I found out what she was doing with the money. Paying bills online wasn't as popular back then, so I would give her money to go pay our bills during banking hours. One day I got pulled over and was charged with no insurance on my vehicle, so I knew something was up. It turned out she was taking the money for bills and buying drugs. When the notices for no payment would come in the mail, she would hide them or rip them up. I handed her separation papers on our first anniversary and never looked back. I'm now happily married to a great woman. We were actually interviewed for the show Bridezillas. I said I wouldn't get married if we were on that show. Everything was yelled at and never said in a calm voice. She threw an actual jumping fit over the color of ties. People were constantly added and subtracted from the invitation list. Anyway, she was the same during the marriage. It was a typical bad marriage because of finances. She was a spendthrift, and living that way just caused much suffering. We had an expensive wedding that I'm still paying for. My girlfriend of 10 years is very down-to-earth and level-headed. We finally decided to get married later this year, and she's feeling a lot of phantom pressure to do things a certain way. It's not like there is an overbearing mom or catty friends applying pressure. It's just the whole idea is overwhelming and filled to the brim with opportunities to make a decision you might end up regretting later, or forever. I've taken a more active role in narrowing down options, instead of asking her to pick a perfect solution out of a million possible options. It's helped somewhat, but there is still a lot of pressure on her, seemingly out of nowhere, to make a series of decisions that all depend upon the first few big decisions that are weighing heavily on her. What I'm trying to say is, I can see how this kind of stuff could turn a normal woman into a lunatic. These types of events tend to bring latent family and friend drama to the forefront, and emotions are high before things even really get started. Wedding planners, what's your worst Bridezilla story? I worked at a wedding where the bride and groom were hippie potheads, and the groom's father was the chief of the local police. They were all from the same little town. One side of the room was a sea of cops. The other was dreadlocked, patchouli-wearing, barefooted hippies. After dinner was over, the entire hippie crowd went outside and stood in a huge circle and smoked massive amounts of weed while the cops looked on with utter disgust on their faces. It was epic. The bride was also high on pills and came to when she caught wind that someone was planning an after-party without her approval, and she didn't like that one bit. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, "Where is she?" over and over again while she stormed around in search of her victim. When she found the girl, who was a bridesmaid, she proceeded to freak the out on her in the middle of the dance floor, in front of 300 people. The bridesmaid started to cry and the bride completely lost her mind. All anyone could do was stare with our mouths hung wide open in disbelief. The words that came out of that bride were some of the absolute worst known to mankind. Several people tried to step in, but the bride lashed out at everyone. It was the single most disgusting thing I've ever seen. The girl ran off and the bride proceeded to pass out on a couch in the bathroom. When it's your big day, for the love of God, please don't take pills. I work at a wedding bakery, and part of my job is to help pair couples with the correct designer for their cake. One bride wanted a cake large enough to feed 500 people, and she wanted it to float. This multi-tiered cake was going to be filled with fresh berries and custard, covered with buttercream and fondant, and decorated with edible flowers and more fresh fruit. And she wanted us to somehow defy the laws of physics and make it float. Apparently, she had seen a floating cake in an anime and decided nothing else was acceptable. When I told her we can't make floating cakes, she threw her coffee on the floor and cried that we were ruining her wedding. Her fiancé ushered her out the door, and I never saw either of them again. Another flat-out refused to make any decisions because her mom gave her $10,000 for the cake, so she whined that she may as well just buy a cheap Duncan Hines one. This sticks out to me because 10 grand is more than the total budget for a lot of weddings, and this chick whined because it was her cake budget. One bride threatened to leave her fiancé before they were even married because he didn't want a chocolate cake. He told her his kids were allergic and walked out on the appointment. She was absolutely shocked. Another brought her ex to the appointment instead of her fiancé. She introduced him as such, which is how I know he wasn't the groom. They were blatantly flirty, and the bride joked that they would be getting married if he made more money and could treat her like a princess. It was an outside ceremony at a golf course, with an inside reception. About an hour before the ceremony, the skies went dark and storm clouds began rolling in. I tell my outdoor bride that we need to call the wedding no later than 30 minutes in advance, so we have time to move guests indoors, as well as any other items. In this case, the bride had a beautiful indoor location that was easily used for both ceremony and reception. I suggest to the bride that she move her ceremony inside. She says no, she wants it outside. I show her the clouds. It's Seattle, she says. There are always clouds. Well, yeah, but these are storm clouds, and you have 200 people sitting outside on a golf course. She still won't budge. No amount of reasoning is helping. 20 minutes before the ceremony, and it starts to get windy. Nothing big yet, but this is just another sign that wet weather is upon us. She still won't reconsider. Several guests are seated outside. Many hover inside the reception area because it's cold out now. I tell her it's the last call and warn her what happens if it rains during the ceremony. She still wants it outside. The ceremony begins. It starts to sprinkle. Bridesmaids are getting wet as they walk down the aisle. Shoes are sinking into the grass. Guests are looking worried. The bride walks down the aisle just as big wind gusts begin. Rain starts to fall in earnest. Guests try to use umbrellas, but it's just too gusty. We aren't even 5 minutes into the ceremony when the heavens suddenly open and it pours. Guests start screeching and start moving inside. The ceremony is still happening for the bride, but guests are bailing. Musicians grab their instruments and head inside. The bridal party continue to stand there like nothing is happening, much like the band on the Titanic. There are maybe 20 guests left. Everyone else has bailed. It is an open downpour. Anyone left is just soaked. The officiant is rushing now, though there isn't really anyone left to witness vows. Before they got to the kiss, lightning began. At that point, they finally bailed. The bride and bridal party spent the reception looking like drowned rats. The bride was just ruined, runny makeup, hair smooshed. She had rashes on her skin from being wet all night. Wet lace and heavy ball gowns are not easily worn wet. All the decor that was meant to move inside following the ceremony was ruined. Thousands of dollars on flowers and centerpieces down the drain, literally. And in the end, hardly anyone witnessed the ceremony at all, and they didn't even get to finish. Bad bride. I work as a hotel manager, and we see bridezillas all the time. The worst was when a bride was so upset that she couldn't fit all of her bridesmaids on one shuttle back from the reception that she tried to physically assault the driver. He left her on the side of the road when she tried to bite him. The kicker? When the groom found out and came to get her, she was acting so crazy that he went to pick her up with her parents, and when they found her trudging back down the highway and heard about her shitty attitude, they left her there too. I worked for a few years as a wedding singer. The worst wedding disaster I've seen was directly caused by a bridezilla. If you've ever been to a wedding, you know that weddings run behind schedule. This bride was adamant that everything should be on time. Of course, it being a wedding, everything was running behind for about 30 minutes. At 7:55, she could no longer handle that the wedding was running late and decided to skip ahead to the hora, the traditional Jewish wedding dance. The hora was scheduled for 8 p.m. We, the band and the wedding planner, suggested that we should not skip ahead, but she was having none of it. With her face red with effort, she screamed at us that Hava Nagila would start at 8 p.m. and not a minute later. Well, she was paying us, so we did what we were told. We started Hava Nagila at precisely 8 p.m. The guests rose and began to form a circle, as they have done countless times before. But something was amiss. The groom was nowhere to be found. The bride was alone in the center of the circle. As if on autopilot, the guests danced and sang while the bride's expression changed from confused to horrified to hysterical. It was a train wreck. They finished the dance without the groom ever arriving. The bride was sobbing uncontrollably. The groom was outside having a cigarette because the wedding was running 30 minutes late. He knew the schedule and thought he had time for the cigarette. In the end, it was the bride's own stubborn insistence that led to the tragic ending. She was the captain of her own Titanic, and we were the band playing as it sank. I sometimes wonder how that marriage worked out. My number one advice to people getting married is to enjoy their wedding day. Instead of trying to control and manage everything, spend your wedding day celebrating with your guests. No wedding ever goes perfectly. Considering you ideally only do it once, do your best to enjoy the ride. I briefly worked in event production management. I had the pleasure of being at this event working a photo booth at a beautiful church. It's a simple gig. The weather was gorgeous, the view was gorgeous, everything was great. The second I got there, one of our photographers comes up to me with a glass of champagne, chugs it, and says, "I've been here since noon." It was 8 p.m. In the distance, the bride was screaming and cussing up a storm. I talked to the photographer a bit longer and found out that the bride punched her mother in the face during photos. The bride kicked out the groom's best man and she cussed out our videographer. This woman was going mad. Everything was cussing, screaming, yelling, scolding. To put it in perspective, halfway through the reception, the bride shouted for her pussy bitch husband to get our money's worth at the photo booth. Later that night, I watched her shove a groomsman to the ground when he asked her to calm down. She eventually broke into tears randomly at some point. Wedding DJ here, and it wasn't the bride, it was a groomzilla. For some reason, the newlyweds decided to invite the bride's son's father. The dance floor cleared early and everyone was in the photo booth or outside smoking and drinking, except the baby daddy and the groom. They're sitting at a table alone and appear to be having a raucous, laughing conversation. A short while later, their faces are getting angry looking. The groom now has his finger on the baby daddy's chest and shouts, "He calls me dad now! I'm his father!" The groomsmen come running in to hold them both back. The groom flips the table over. The bride is now in tears. It was magical. I used to shoot wedding videos. I was assigned this wedding and no one told me anything was special about it. I show up and it was an Indian wedding. The bride and groom had already eloped months earlier, and this was all for show. So what did the bride and groom do? Sat there and talked about all their guests. I had way too much audio about how the bride's mother's cousin was a drunk and a slut. Then we go to the reception. The reception lasted 8 hours. I brought enough batteries and tapes, but Jesus, that was a long time. I set a camera up at one end of the hall for a long shot, then a slightly closer shot from over the DJ booth, and I was doing handheld camera work. Every few songs, I'd move my long shot cam to get a different angle. Now we go into the edit phase. This is really the first time I ever interacted with the couple. I got shots while they were getting ready, but we didn't really talk that much. So I'm editing and we have a standard format we follow. A montage in the beginning, ceremony footage, first dance, father-daughter dance, mom-son dance, cake cutting, random footage of people dancing, basic stuff. It ends up being about 2 to 4 hours once everything is done. Theirs was 5 hours long. We gave them a copy and the next day the bride stormed in, demanding the rest of her wedding. I have no idea what she's talking about and I don't get paid for any re-editing work. We gave her an hour longer than any video I'd ever done, but that wasn't enough. She wanted all 8 hours of the reception. I loaded all my shots up and did huge cuts where I'd stay on a shot until it sucked, then I'd change it. Some shots wouldn't move for 3 songs. There was no way I was spending a lot of time on this. We finally finished and exported the video to DVD. We called her in and she wanted to watch it in the store, and she brought a notepad. As she's watching, she's making an edit list of things she wants me to change. That list ended up being 3 pages. I stood up, looked her in the face, and said, "This job isn't worth it. I quit." That was the last wedding video I ever edited. We've had quite a few Bridezillas and mother-in-law Zillas over the years. During the first dance between the bride and groom, the mother-in-law began crying and cut between the two of them, danced with her son for a moment, and then sank down to her knees. She gradually kept moving down until her face was on the floor. When her husband and the bride's father went over to get her up, she was a blubbering mess. Mascara like wild tree roots across her cheeks, snotty nose, red eyes, quivering double chin, the works. It was painful to watch. Another bride wasn't happy with her husband-to-be's vows, so she requested a time out for him to go to the back room and come up with better ones. When the guy marrying them politely explained that he was on a very tight schedule, she called him a lying bastard and huffed back up the aisle into the room. We kept everyone else seated and she appeared a few minutes later with freshly written vows for her future husband. He read them and the wedding continued as planned. Again, uncomfortable. We rarely get a groomzilla, but one in particular stands out. The groom wasn't happy with anything. The bride had her heart set on white roses, but he said he didn't like roses, so he requested sunflowers and white chrysanthemums. When we presented him with an example display of sunflowers and chrysanthemums, he said he didn't like that either and requested another 2 or 3 separate types before finally settling on a bunch of plain peonies. He did the same sort of thing with the food, music, and entertainment, ignoring the fact that we have deadlines to meet. The bride had 0 say and didn't try to fight him on it. At another wedding, some little kid rubbed his finger along the cake icing, leaving an unattractive mark on it. Understandably, the bride was pissed, but she lost her with the groom as the kid was on his side of the family. This caused a rift between the 2 families. Whether or not they patched things up, I have no idea. Another bride went into full-on tantrum mode when a few things didn't quite go to plan. Rain, wind, a couple of late guests, and 2 hungover bridesmaids. She literally threw her hands in the air and said, "Well, we might as well cancel the whole f***ing thing then." The wedding did not continue. For all the shitty ones, though, there have been some absolutely wonderful ones. I've worked as a waiter at one of the more fancy wedding reception venues in my city, and we get a lot of old Italian, Greek, and generally European family weddings. I have two that stand out. The groom got mega-plastered and smashed a bottle of cognac on the dance floor and literally tried to set it on fire. The function supervisor tried to tell him very politely that he couldn't, and he got upset about that and started screaming, "This is my wedding, and if I want to burn this place down, I will." Cops were called. At another wedding, it was speech time, and the bride gets up to say a few things about how her deceased mother was an inspiration to her, etc. General heartfelt wedding stuff. Her father stands up after and had a few words to say. "You ungrateful little You're the spitting image of your dead mother. I paid $40,000 for this, and I don't even get a mention? You and your dirt husband." Security stepped in at this point and tried to calm him down, so he takes a swing at security and gets kicked out. Cops were also called. I'm not a wedding planner, but I work closely with brides and grooms. I work in the vintage diamond ring business. I'll never forget working with one amazing groom. He spent a small fortune on a gorgeous Victorian engagement ring. It was one of the most beautiful rings I had ever seen. Imagine my shock when I received a call from the groom the next day. She apparently hated the ring and threw a fit because, her words, he bought her a used ring from a garage sale. The ring was from one of the best vintage jewelry stores in the United States and cost $94,000. My friend is a wedding photographer. One time he got punched in the face by the groom because the groom decided that the photographer was taking too many photos of the bride. Weddings seem to bring out the worst in humanity. I was booking a wedding at my store. A young couple comes in and is picking stuff out. As usual, the guy has an I don't care attitude about wedding things. Brides are never happy about this. We go through their options for a bit, but when it comes to picking vest styles, they get into a huge argument right in front of me and my colleague. Eventually, the groom throws up his hands and says, "If we can't decide about colors, then we shouldn't get married." He walks out the door and leaves in his car. The bride starts crying in our store while we are just bewildered. My colleague asked if she was okay. She said she was having someone come pick her up and walked out the door crying. Never saw them again. It's a famous story in our store. I was hired to assist a wedding planner. I had to tie the mother of the bride's sari. While I'm tying it, she tells me I am doing it wrong and wants me to do it her way. I told her that she won't be able to walk if I tied it like she requested. She starts to get frustrated, so I tie her sari in the way she wants. This woman doesn't know how to tie a sari. She apparently doesn't wear them. She comes out and starts screaming and yelling at the wedding planner that I don't know how to tie a sari and now she can't walk. She is in tears. So the planner takes her away, calms her down, and corrects her sari. This leaves me in the prep room with the other girls and the bride. The bride turns to me and starts saying, "How dare you make my mother cry on this day? You are a horrible person, and you are ruining the most important day of my life." I couldn't help it, but I started to laugh and couldn't stop. It was so dramatic. Nothing was ruined. It took 10 minutes to fix, and the mother wouldn't listen to me about how to put one on in the first place. The bride started screaming at me, get out, I don't want to see your face, you ruined everything," and started to cry. I laughed even harder and said, "You are in for a surprise if you think a poorly tied sari is the worst thing in the world." I turned to the wedding planner and told her to pay me so I could go home. The wedding planner called me the next week to help with another wedding. I said no. Wedding shop workers, what are your worst Bridezilla stories? I work as a wedding server. As soon as someone says Bridezilla, this one story where the manager of our hotel had to shut down the wedding halfway through comes to mind. This was the Bridezilla of all the Bridezillas I've ever seen. There were a lot of little things leading up that were normal Bridezilla until the wedding took a sharp turn. At one point, she accused the wedding server staff of stealing her veil. The manager found it in her room and also showed her the card swipes proving only she had been in the room that day. About 20 minutes later, she was screaming at some poor front desk employee accusing her of stealing her wedding boots. The manager intervened again, and after a long talk, the photographer told them he had a photo of the boots on the staircase of the church and asked if she had worn them since. When she said no, she told the manager it was his job to pick them up and made sure she had them. The church was not related to our hotel at all. Shortly after, she started opening the wedding gifts frantically inside the ballroom and screaming at everyone, guests included, saying someone had stolen her wedding certificate. After that, our manager gathered the wedding staff and told us to take off our uniform jackets, empty them in front of him, then clock out and go home. We all did. None of us stole anything. And we heard the next day that the maid of honor had the certificate, and the wedding was shut down completely after we left. Photographer here. During my more than a dozen years in this business, I've had almost nothing but fantastic clients, real sweethearts, and I consider myself lucky. The exception was a New York bride who was pissed because it rained cats and dogs on her wedding day. Not sure if she understood I wasn't in charge of making the weather. She had wanted to take golf carts to the beach with the wedding party to do fun photos there, but that clearly didn't happen. Her foul mood spoiled a bit of the wedding. Good thing everyone else still appeared to be having a good time regardless. She managed to stay barely polite to her vendors. Weeks later, she unleashed on me because I had delivered, among hundreds of photos, 2 shots of the DJ. She calculated that those photos, based on my fee, had cost her $14. She also flipped her wig because, she told me angrily, she'd observed me eating a few canapes during the reception. And at $3 apiece, how did I not understand those were not intended for the hired help? I offered to refund her $23 and inquired where she wanted me to send the check. At that point, she calmed down a bit, possibly realizing how ridiculous she was being, and then volunteered that maybe she was being a bit irrational at the moment because she was pregnant. Of course, I offered my congratulations. She grudgingly told me to keep the check. I work at a restaurant as a baker. One bride wanted a 5-layer cake. The act of putting one cake on top of another is $60, plus decoration fees if you want it to look seamless. We told her this cake was going to cost her a lot. Decorative flowers are crazy expensive and not worth it, so we always advise brides to use fake plastic flowers. This bride wanted real ones. She said they would be in the hall waiting for us. We made the cake just how she wanted and went to the hall to set it up. The wedding planner is there too. We set up everything and started looking for our flowers. The wedding planner has no clue what we're talking about. She only had enough flowers for the table centerpieces. We start to panic. The bride wanted real flowers and paid our fee for putting flowers on the cake. We couldn't get a hold of anyone in the wedding party since the ceremony had already started. We decide to steal a few flowers out of every centerpiece to fill the empty places on the cake. It isn't as full as it should be, but it looked okay. The next day, the bride calls, crying her eyes out. Apparently, we ruined her wedding day, and she wants a full refund. We told her what happened on our end, and she screamed at us that we ruined her day. My boss asked where the flowers were for her cake, and she told us that she never ordered extra flowers. My boss just laughed and explained to her that we told her she needed to provide the flowers. It was in the contract she signed with us. I'm not totally sure what happened after that, but my boss tells everyone in our restaurant bakery that no one from this point on is allowed to book wedding cakes because brides are very hard to deal with. I spent 4 years of my life working in a men's formal wear rental in a Seattle suburb in the 90s. My most memorable bridezilla was this woman who came in with her fiancé. She wanted a very specific shirt color to match her diamond white gown, 14 of them. Okay, pretty straightforward, but when you're renting shirts, I can't guarantee that every shirt will even be the same color, let alone that exact shade of diamond white. I explained this to the bride twice. She agreed. Cue 6 weeks later, the Thursday before the wedding. Bridezilla comes in with her fiancé. The shirts are exactly as I warned her they would be, several shades, and only one was her perfect color. Upon hearing this, she lost her ever-loving shit. She started screaming, pounding on our glass countertop, and wailing at the top of her lungs that we were discriminating against her because she's half Japanese. Yeah, hun, so is half of Greater Seattle. She got so agitated, she shattered our front counter with her pounding. The cops were called, and the bride got arrested. Groom took his and everyone else's tuxes and left. By Sunday, I happened to be accepting returns. The father of the groom comes back with 14 unworn tuxes. He explains that the bride spent 24 hours in jail after my spineless manager refused to press charges. At the rehearsal dinner, the bride threw some insane temper tantrum, complete with throwing glassware, swearing, and finally punching the groom in the face. He declined to proceed with the wedding. I will never forget that woman's crazy eyes, or her insistence on the perfectly colored shirts from a $90 rental. I'm a wedding event planner in Toronto. I own my own planning company, and I have been in the industry for about 8 years. I have so many Bridezilla stories that I don't know which to choose. I had a bride that openly spoke utter and complete shit about the groom's family in front of his face. She would say that they were crazy, tacky, and annoying. When the wedding came, her family was actually the hardest family I ever had to deal with, and the groom's family was absolutely lovely. On top of all this, the bride yelled at the vendors all day, resulting in the videographers leaving after just 1 hour of shooting and the photographer crying in the bathroom. The groom and the bride's cousins apologized to me for her behavior all night. I had another horrible bride, who I planned an amazing wedding for. She raved about how much she loved the food all evening, but the day after the wedding, she wrote a bad review about the caterer on Yelp and told me she wouldn't remove it unless they gave her a discount. Another was a horrific couple that didn't care about anyone. The groom was 30 minutes late for the ceremony, but it was no big deal because the bride was 2 hours late. After the ceremony, we had to shorten cocktails to make up for lost time. The couple got wasted in their limo, and both ended up falling asleep. They were both so late for their own reception that I had the venue serve dinner without them. Their parents were furious. The bride's parents left early, and the couple didn't arrive until 11 p.m. Half of their guests left before they arrived, and they yelled at me for allowing dinner to start before their arrival. I work for a florist. We have several high-end venues we are exclusive with. Lots of money breeds lots of entitlements, so we get pretty horrendous bridezillas on the regular. One I remember was a woman who was very sweet up until after her wedding. We had to substitute peonies because they weren't in season, so she opted for garden roses instead. It also rained on her wedding day. Not just a sprinkle either. It was tornado sirens and stuff falling over kind of rain. The power went out, and the hotel used all of their backup generators to light her ceremony and reception for the 3 hours the power was out. None of that was her fault, but none was ours or the hotel's either. Nature's gonna nature. However, she tried to sue not only us for screwing up her bouquet, but also the hotel for not letting her ceremony be outside. Thankfully, we always record consultations and have contracts notifying all parties. She couldn't do anything to us, but she did blast us on Yelp, Facebook, and any other social media she could. We threatened to sue her back for defamation, and she removed them all. The hotel has similar practices and also a ton of money to throw against her in court, so they basically told her to bring it, and she backed off. I worked in event planning at a casino and worked on a bunch of weddings. Most people are stressed, but otherwise decent human beings. The others are monsters. There was a bride that decided on the morning of her wedding that she hated her dress and expected me to fix that for her. She had seen pictures of Gwen Stefani's wedding dress and wanted me to either dip dye her David's bridal clearance dress ombre pink or just procure a couture dress for her. When I told her neither was possible, she screamed, "What am I even paying you for?" and threw her shoes at me. She did get married in the offending dress, but looked miserable the whole time. Then there was the Momzilla who showed up in a white dress, an ascot-sized hat, and a parrot. No, I am not kidding. She brought a freaking bright red macaw, screaming its head off because it was stressed out by all the people and being attached to a crazy person by a leash. Another bride started demanding we serve the same food at her bargain wedding reception. She had seen what was being served at the spared, no-expense, super-rich reception being held in another ballroom. She'd paid only for a cocktail reception. Hors d'oeuvres, drinks, a champagne toast, and a pretty basic wedding cake, but was suddenly screaming at the serving staff to get some real food in there for her guests. When they refused, she actually followed a server back to the kitchens and was trying to load up trays herself. We ended up placating her with some extra hors d'oeuvres, but she still had the gall to complain to my bosses about the whole night. I worked at a David's bridal, and I have to say that I never really had a bridezilla. It was always the moms, grandmas, sisters, and friends who were terrible. Either they hated what the bride would pick out for them to wear, or they would hate what she was picking out for herself. At DB, we have strict appointment guidelines when it comes to time, and most brides who bring an entourage wouldn't find a dress because everyone would bombard her with their opinions and overwhelm her. The worst thing I've ever witnessed was when a bride who struggled with her weight came in. She was overweight and had been working extremely hard on it over the last year. It was a slow day, so all of us in the store decided to help. She finally found a dress that she loved, and she started crying tears of joy. Then she looked at her mom and asked for her opinion, and her mom looked at her and said, "You look fat in it." We all stood there in silence, and the bride lost her happiness. She asked to be assisted in taking it off, and they left. It was one of the saddest days that I had experienced there. I work at a facility that we rent out for weddings. We probably host like 8 weddings a year. Weddings truly bring out the worst in people. You can have the calmest person on your first meeting, but by the time the wedding rolls around, that bride will be hell on wheels. My most recent bride was having her second wedding. She kept trying to use everything for free, even though she had signed a very specific contract that stated what she could and could not do. She pitched a fit over that. Then, on the day of the wedding, she threw a nuclear meltdown when her bridesmaids got tired of taking photographs after 3 hours and went somewhere to get warm. She started screaming at the photographer that she was going to keep taking pictures, and to hell with all of them. I had a monster-in-law one time who, after seeing and approving of the chairs that we provided, caused a scene of epic proportions after she decided that the chairs weren't good enough anymore. The bride was sobbing by the end of it, being consoled by monster-in-law who kept telling her, "It'll be all right, even though everything is ruined by these green chairs." Another bride rented our facility for her classy wedding. She was a bitch with a capital B. She refused to make eye contact with any staff member, got people's attention by snapping her fingers at them, and made a complete fool of herself when she and her groom showed up, plastered to the reception. A rumor had started to spread that she was pregnant, which is why they were getting married. She furiously denied this in a speech to everyone gathered at the wedding. The baby was born 5 months later, a healthy 10 pounds. It now costs a lot of money to get married at my place of work, and bridal parties must sign an 8-page contract. I worked in management at a resort in a popular tourist town. When weddings are booked at our venue, we can only hold a certain number of rooms for guests attending. A manager was always required to check in the couple, and I had been given a heads up by the coordinator about the Bridezilla. They wanted a room on the highest floor and closer to the beach, so they were booked into the honeymoon suite. 3rd floor with ocean views. Nope, she wanted higher and closer. She had an absolute meltdown at the front desk when I explained there was nothing higher or closer. She started screaming at me and her husband-to-be. He was very apologetic and tried to calm her down. She was placated and sent off with keys, and less than 30 minutes later, she was back and demanded we empty the rooms next to and below her. "Honey, those rooms cost $700 a night and we are fully booked." I was lucky enough to not be working the night of the wedding, but I heard all about her abusing the waitstaff, kicking the band out for playing a song she didn't like, and the screaming match she got into with her mother-in-law. What a peach. The groom left the front desk staff a box of wine to apologize for her behavior. She's not the only Bridezilla, but definitely the craziest we had. My worst bride was an Ivy League-educated shrink. She tried to play mind games with everyone involved in the planning of the wedding and frequently had fits. She and I butted heads because she wanted a carpet running straight from the bottom of the stairs to the doors of the chapel. I told her it wasn't possible, as they didn't line up. She kept asking me if I was sure, even after I showed her exactly what I meant. She narrowed her eyes and told me she thought I had a problem with the truth. She was very controlling with the groom as well. I remembered their names and looked them up on Facebook a while back. They're now divorced and he appears to be happily remarried. I work at a bakery and part of my job is to help pair couples with the correct designer for their wedding cake. One bride threatened to leave her fiancé before they were even married because he didn't want a chocolate cake. He told her his kids were allergic and walked out on the appointment. She was absolutely shocked. Another woman wanted a penis-shaped cake. We do make them usually for bachelorette parties. And screamed at her fiancé in the parking lot when he said he wouldn't pay for it. Another brought her ex to the appointment instead of her fiancé. She introduced him as such, which is the only reason I know he wasn't the groom. They were very blatantly flirty, and the bride joked that they would be getting married if he only made more money and could treat her like a princess. I work as a hotel manager, and we see bridezillas all the time. The worst was when a bride was so upset that she couldn't fit all of her bridesmaids on one shuttle back from the reception that she tried to physically assault the driver. He left her on the side of the road when she tried to bite him. When the groom found out and came to get her, she was acting so crazy that he went to pick her up with her parents, and when they found her trudging back down the highway and heard about her shitty attitude, they left her there too. I briefly worked in event production management. I had the pleasure of being at this event working a photo booth at a beautiful church. The weather was gorgeous, the view was gorgeous, everything was great. The second I got there, one of our photographers comes up to me with a glass of champagne, chugs it, and says, "I've been here since noon." It was 8 p.m. In the distance, the bride was screaming and cussing up a storm. I talked to the photographer a bit longer and found out that the bride punched her mother in the face during photos. The bride kicked out the groom's best man and she cussed out our videographer. This woman was going mad. Everything was cussing, screaming, yelling, scolding. Later that night, I watched her shove a groomsman to the ground when he asked her to calm down. She eventually broke into tears randomly at some point. Wedding caterer here. Groomzilla is uncommon but not unheard of. I had a groom who freaked out that we didn't have nice enough barware and spent $8,000 on brand new glasses. He threw a tantrum when I refused to buy them from him when we were settling the bill. A different groomzilla stalked about the entire night, fussing with the table settings, adjusting centerpieces, and complaining to service staff that this person or that didn't have a full glass. His father told him to cut it out and let us do our jobs. He sulked the rest of the evening. Another groom surprised everyone with a long and awkward skit with inside jokes that only he and 2 of the 200 guests were privy to. He then decided that he'd top that off with an amateur drum solo to a slideshow of photos of his childhood pet. The bride's family cleared out before dessert was done. We rarely get a groomzilla, but one in particular stands out. The groom wasn't happy with anything. The bride had her heart set on white roses, but he said he didn't like roses, so he requested sunflowers and white chrysanthemums. When we presented him with an example display of sunflowers and chrysanthemums, he said he didn't like that either and requested another 2 or 3 separate types before finally settling on a bunch of plain peonies. He did the same sort of thing with the food, music, and entertainment, ignoring the fact that we have deadlines to meet. The bride had zero say and didn't try to fight him on it. At another wedding, some little kid rubbed his finger along the cake icing, leaving an unattractive mark on it. Understandably, the bride was pissed, but she lost her with the groom as the kid was on his side of the family. This caused a rift between the 2 families. Whether or not they patched things up, I have no idea. Another bride went into full-on tantrum mode when a few things didn't quite go to plan. Rain, wind, a couple of late guests, and 2 hungover bridesmaids. She literally threw her hands in the air and said, "Well, we might as well cancel the whole f***ing thing then." The wedding did not continue. I was booking a wedding at my store. A young couple comes in and is picking stuff out. As usual, the guy has an I don't care attitude about wedding things. Brides are never happy about this. We go through their options for a bit, but when it comes to picking vest styles, they get into a huge argument right in front of me and my colleague. Eventually, the groom throws up his hands and says, "If we can't decide about colors, then we shouldn't get married." He walks out the door and leaves in his car. The bride starts crying in our store while we are just bewildered. My colleague asked if she was okay. She said she was having someone come pick her up and walked out the door crying. Never saw them again. It's a famous story in our store. Wedding band guitar player here. A drunken groomzilla physically attacked us when we cut off the music after already going an hour over our contracted time. The mother of the groom got into the mix and pulled him back. The bride was in tears. The best man pulled out a Bluetooth speaker and kept the party going. We did not get a 5-star review. Their marriage lasted only a few months. Wedding photographers, what are some signs that a marriage is doomed? Wedding photographer here. I've been shooting for a while with a famous studio here in Singapore. Sometimes the red flags don't necessarily lead to a breakup. You'll be surprised at how durable relationships are and how much compromise and forgiveness go through a marriage. Anyway, here are the usual red flags in my experience. The bridezillas and groomzillas. I avoid these people from the start because it means trouble for vendors like us. Their demands show their personality. Often, these demanding attitudes are a major downfall in relationships and marriages. When the couple argues in front of you, I've seen it happen a lot. I even had a couple who looked like they just had a really big fight before meeting me. If the couple refuses to pay, if you're going to be an a-hole to vendors, there's no way you won't be an a-hole to your partner at some point, because money is a big issue, and it often means it will become an issue to either of you down the road. When I see the couple encounter a massive screw-up, how they react is the deal breaker for me. I've seen the lights go out at the banquet hall for a good 30 minutes, and the guests were already kind of freaking out, but the bride and groom stayed chill. I instantly knew they were going to last. If they could be cool through this stressful big day in their lives, they'd be cool when rocky stuff happens. Ex-wedding photographer here. Typically, I saw red flags when the bride or groom is super quiet. And I mean really silent. Just watching. One instance was a groom who barely said 10 words to anyone during the ceremony or reception afterward. The bride and her mother were extremely loud and excited the entire time. I dropped off the photo bundle with them 2 weeks later and he was still quiet. She, however, complained about all of the pictures because the groom wasn't smiling enough. She wanted a discount because I couldn't make him look happy. They got divorced about a year later. I know this because I did his engagement photos with his new fiancée about 4 years after his first wedding. His engagement photos showed him much happier. Wedding videographer here. A couple flew my team out to Iceland for their engagement shoot. The first couple of days were fine and everything looked okay, but in Iceland, some lodging options aren't very luxurious. The groom chose to book what was essentially a tiny bunkhouse, the ones meant for summer camps, and the bride lost it and complained the whole night. The next morning, things were pretty tense, but we continued with the shoot as planned, even though it is now incredibly awkward. Most of our plans fall through because they start arguing in front of a beautiful solitary glacier for 2 hours. Our team can hear them yelling at each other half a mile away because there is literally no one else around for miles. We finished up whatever we could on the last day of the shoot and awkwardly said our goodbyes. Later, I learned that they broke up a month before the wedding. Early in my career, I filmed wedding videos. The interviews always give it away. By the end of the wedding, I usually have a pretty good idea of who's going to last and who won't, and I've proven it over the years. I asked one groom in a recorded interview why he asked her to marry him, and he said, "The pressure to get married." They lasted less than 2 months. I hadn't even finished the video and their marriage was already over. There's something about the way couples look at each other when they're together and then talk about each other when they're away from each other. Some examples I've personally seen are when the husband can't describe his wife with anything other than, "She's beautiful." They got divorced. When one of the two doesn't want to have cake smashed in their face, but the other one does it anyway. Yep, divorced. When one gets really drunk at the wedding and the other one does not. Divorced. Happened to 2 couples I worked with. I'm not a photographer, but I used to work at a David's bridal. One bride came in with her friends. We did the say yes to the dress thing, and an hour later she's standing there with $3,000 worth of stuff, but doesn't have any money with her. She decides she wants to apply for a store credit card, so I run it through the system. She gets denied. She then calls the groom for his info, but he tells her no. Suddenly, she threw a huge fit on the phone with him while standing on the bridal stage, literally demanding, "Why not? Why? Like an actual child. I've never seen a 30-year-old age backwards so quickly. She was literally stomping her feet in front of me, all her friends, and the other brides in the store. I was so embarrassed for her. Eventually, she hangs up on him, and her friend is like, "I'm so sorry you can't get your dress." And the bride instantly stops crying and just goes, "Oh, I will get the dress. I just have to do this at home, and when he gets mad enough, he'll come get it for me, so I'll stop." Sure enough, the bride came back 2 days later with the groom, and he applied for the credit card and bought the dress. He was livid but silent, and she was smug as hell. Can't imagine they're having a happy marriage if they are still together. I'm a wedding videographer. I try to get to know both people beforehand so I can work in their hobbies or unique traits in my product. A big red flag is when one person is clearly trying to change the other. I had one dude who loved poker, craft beer, cigars, video games, and hanging with his rowdy friends. I planned a cool shoot where I had all his friends in an Old West-style saloon. But she steps in and declares, "Oh, he won't be doing any of those things anymore." Poor bastard just sat there in silence as I awkwardly had to plan them shopping for a Yorkie puppy instead. Halfway through post-production after the wedding, he called and said he was getting an annulment. I wanted to say, could have told you so, but I try to stay neutral. Longtime wedding photographer here. I've been in the business long enough to have seen a few of my clients get divorced, so yes, I kind of have a sixth sense for these things. One common red flag is the groom's attitude toward the whole wedding. If he's all just about getting plastered with his buddies, that's a huge red flag. However, even some of the ones who I thought were really sweet and into each other still ended in divorce. I think with some people you can never tell, but with others, it is painfully obvious that their marriage is a train wreck from the beginning. The wedding where the bride's dad brought a shotgun to the wedding ended in divorce. If either of the couple looks down on the other, they're pretty much doomed. I think another red flag is if the bride constantly went back to her parents to consult or complain about issues that pop up instead of talking it out with her groom. It's possible that couples who do this can change, but it has always been a red flag if either of them is too attached to mom and dad fixing their problems, rather than working on it with each other. Some other red flags I notice: have kids together before marriage, divorced; vastly incompatible religious views, divorced; most military weddings I've shot, divorced; second or third marriages, divorced; married young, surprisingly not as big a factor as you'd think. Many are still together. Not a photographer, but I taught hundreds of couples their first wedding dance. After working one-on-one with them for months, I know which marriages would thrive and which couples would crash and burn, and by what year into the marriage too. There are couples who, when learning together a new skill, regardless of talent towards that new skill, complement each other when one of them achieves something. Those couples are going to make it in life. Couples who pass the blame onto the other one when challenged always put my divorce spidey senses up. Couples who love to argue and bicker like it's a sport, however, are also going to make it together in life because some people just totally get off on it. And you can tell when you ask them mid-argument if everything is going okay, and they instantly smile, and usually the non-dominant partner says something like, "Oh yes, we are fine, sorry." Then there are couples who are way too different from one another, but it's crystal clear that they love each other. They will make it until the kids leave, then it'll just be them, and they divorce. Lastly, some couples don't even look each other in the eye or have trouble with maintaining eye contact for more than 5 seconds. I give those couples 5 years tops. I'm a boudoir photographer. If you didn't know, boudoir albums are a popular gift from brides to grooms. The experience and photos are typically a huge ego boost for the bride and a cherished bonus for the groom. Typically, we have a professional hairstylist and makeup artist on site to glam up the bride. Most clients bring a friend, and we encourage this for their comfort. Happy people make the best photos after all. However, if the bride spends the bulk of the time complaining to their friend about the groom's opinions and behavior, the relationship tends to fizzle out before the wedding. Worse, the bride spends most of the time upset, texting her groom, or having arguments over the phone because he doesn't like the idea of someone else seeing her in her underwear and is sabotaging the shoot from afar. If a bride has ugly cried during a boudoir shoot arguing with her husband-to-be 9 times out of 10, that marriage doesn't happen. I have a horror story with a groom who is a jealous, possessive, controlling a-hole who tried to run the photo shoot. This guy came in and started choosing the bride's clothing, argued with the hairstylist, and added his own tips to every pose I set up. He spent more time criticizing her than actually being helpful. He was sitting on the far side of the room, out of frame, and yelling his suggestions at her the entire time. Early on, I thought they just enjoyed playfully insulting each other, but this guy took it way too far. He said things like, "Put your ass down, you look like a porn star," and, I kid you not, he commanded the bride to raise her face because he can see her double chin. We finally had to stop the shoot early when he physically tried to get the camera away from me. I stepped off to the side of the studio and asked the stylist to help the client get dressed. She was in tears. The a-hole stepped out for a smoke while she got packed, and the bride, crying, apologized profusely for bringing him. She told me they had arguments leading up to the photo shoot and he insisted on coming. She agreed and decided then that their future hinged on his behavior, and he totally blew it. As others have pointed out, you can tell a whole lot about a relationship by how they interact with each other. Thankfully, horror stories are rare. Wedding videographer here. I don't usually follow the marriage all that closely after the video is delivered, but usually you have a feeling as a neutral third party about whether it's going to last or not. While I agree with most of the stuff mentioned here, I've found that the microcosm of how the couple feels about each other usually comes out during the cake cutting. If they're drinking, then they've usually had a few by that point, and it's a moment when everyone is watching you do something potentially awkward with your new spouse. When I see a new bride or groom aggressively smush cake into the other's face, it's usually a strong sign of an unbalanced relationship. Sometimes they're both having fun with it and you can tell it's cool, but most of the time you can tell that the person with cake on their face is either shocked or angry about it. Again, I don't have hard data to track results, but that's the thing that usually informs my opinion about how it's going to work out. Not a wedding photographer, but I'm a cake artist. I had a couple come in for a tasting. The appointment was for 7 p.m., but he was late. The first half hour was just her. She told me they met at a stable where they both kept their horses. Those horses were going to be featured at the wedding as the bride and groom would ride them to the site, a beautiful farm venue. She described in detail her self-designed medieval gown, flower wreath in her hair, and embroidered shoes. It all sounded lovely. She wanted a cake like a castle, which was a specialty of mine. The whole wedding would be over the top, but not in a cringy way. Then he arrives. He barely says hi to her, sits down, and starts telling me about his wedding. He'll ride in dressed as a riverboat gambler with a frock coat, brocade vest, big hat, gold pocket watch, and sterling silver spurs. He's fine with the castle cake, but wants to incorporate the watch and pistols. I had already decided that I was not going to work with them. There is no way I could come up with a cake that would work for them. But they were there, so I brought out some samples. For the next hour, they carried on 2 entirely separate monologues. They didn't address each other, or me, and they didn't listen to each other, or me. I made no attempt to book them that night, and when they called later in the week, I told them their date had been taken. They were living in 2 incompatible and entirely self-contained fantasies. I doubt they even made it to the wedding day. Ex-wedding photographer here. There were only a couple situations where I had doubts about the couple's future, and one where I was certain. I met the couple in a cafe to discuss their ideas and my services. The bride was very happy and interested. The groom, however, was rolling his eyes and grunting at everything. I stopped trying to get him involved in the conversation after he ignored me twice. This made the bride very uncomfortable, and she was apologetic for his behavior. I don't know what happened to them, as they chose to reschedule their wedding and didn't hire me in the end. I declined to shoot a wedding when the person who was going to hire me was the groom's mom. When I asked her to arrange a meeting with the couple, she said that they didn't want a wedding, meaning they wanted to elope, and it was her initiative to celebrate it. I tried to play the "I want to hear the bride's idea" card, but she told me the bride has no ideas. She obeys the groom, and the groom obeys his mom. Therefore, I'll only talk to the mom. I declined. I hope the bride is fine. No one deserves a controlling mother-in-law. Finally, I was a guest and a photographer at my friend's wedding. The bridesmaid was wearing a short white dress, and she was chirping about how her boyfriend saw her in so many wedding dresses and how she caught 8 bouquets already. She talked a lot about wedding planning, but apparently there hadn't been a formal proposal. Her boyfriend, who was a guest as well, looked very annoyed and clearly wished he were somewhere else. Anyway, the bridesmaid started bugging me for photos of her and her boyfriend a week after the wedding. I told her several times that when I start editing the photos, I will do hers first. But by the time I sent her the photos, they were already broken up. She started dating someone else a month later, and they got married the next year. I'm a former wedding videographer. Sometimes we do letter reads. Basically, the bride writes a letter for the groom and vice versa. The couple reads their letter from their partner before the wedding. It tends to add good emotion since 9 times out of 10 the speeches suck. One bride said at the end of the letter read, which I quote, "Well, that was stupid." She just finished reading the groom's letter and was talking about what he had written. To be fair, what he wrote was not exactly Shakespeare, but still a harsh response. I cut that part out in the final video. Not a photographer, but a party bus driver for almost 5 years. Often we would do the bachelorette and the wedding party. Sometimes we'd get a combined bachelor and bachelorette party. Those are the worst. Why? Because 90% of the time it's the super controlling bride who doesn't want the groom out on his own with his boys. When I became the office manager, I really tried to discourage combined parties, as it seldom ended well. There would almost always be fighting and drama. Lastly, men, if your lady won't let you have a bachelor party but wants her own bachelorette, that's an enormous red flag. Trust me. I was shooting a friend's wedding years ago and witnessed a pretty serious red flag. To close the vows, the couple did a sand mixing metaphor thing where the groom had a vial of white sand and the bride had a vial of black sand. They were to pour them into a tall, empty vial together to make gray sand, symbolizing their inseparable union. As they poured, they could not sync with each other at all. One would slow down, the other would speed up, and vice versa. They ended up pouring almost stratified black and white layers. He nervously giggled, and she looked forlorn as the pastor and guests marveled at their zebra-striped creation. Their marriage lasted about 2 years. I work for a company that does studio guest portraiture for extremely wealthy clients. Most of these clients are appearance-obsessed, so I've seen a lot of couples I don't think would last long. I remember this one couple where the groom's side were all hard drug dealers. They looked pretty scary. And the bride's side were all strippers. Fake bodies everywhere. The groom seemed to care less that it was his wedding, but the bride was the opposite. They had been together for 7 years and had 2 daughters, but from overhearing some of the speeches, the bride had practically begged the groom into getting married. She seemed happy, but he seemed so disinterested. I couldn't help but think that they wouldn't last long. I am a videographer. Most weddings we video are fairly smooth. The couple is happy, the family cries tears of joy, and there's lots of laughter. We did film one wedding that seemed fine up until the aisle walk. We video the bride and groom prep. They have 2 suites, one for the ladies and one for the gentlemen. My partner and I were having an easy time running back and forth. Everyone's drinking, and not light beer either. They're knocking back shots, and there were empty bottles everywhere. Everyone is pretty carefree and ready to party. The bride and groom most of all. This is going to be the easiest wedding we film, or so we thought. Everyone is seated in the ceremony hall. The groom and all his men are up front with the officiant. Bridesmaids start walking down the aisle, then the bride walks in with her father, all beautiful. At this point, I'm filming the groom and his reaction. We get a wide shot because we can always zoom in during post. My partner is recording the groom and her father. I see the best man in my viewfinder pull out a flask from his jacket pocket. The rest of the men do the same except the groom. This is clearly planned. Then, the best man speaks loud enough over the music, so people turn to him away from the bride. He raises his flask high and shouts, "Here's to the bride, here's to the groom. May you never disagree, but if you do..." He points to the bride with his flask and finishes, "F*** you, here's to the groom." They all drink to their frat boy toast. The best man hands the groom his flask and he drinks it while laughing. Jaws dropped. The bride and her father were speechless. The ceremony went on, but there's more. When the officiant asks the bride if she takes the groom as her husband, she weakly says, "I do." The officiant asks the same of the groom, and instead of just answering normally, he screams, "F*** yeah, I do." The bride just face-palms herself in embarrassment. The look of disgust on her whole family's faces the entire night was highly awkward to film. Needless to say, I think that's a big red flag. I was a wedding photographer. I think you can kind of tell if they are going to stay together based on how they handle all the little and sometimes even big problems a wedding day can bring. There was one couple's story I love to tell. They are not your typical bride and groom. They had their wedding in a forest, all vegan food, and a lot of friends with lots of dogs. Everything was perfect, except the special dress the bride had made and painted didn't arrive in time for the ceremony, and she was devastated. She was in her sweatpants and a Mickey Mouse t-shirt at the time, and her soon-to-be husband took off his suit, put on a big white shirt, stood there in his boxer shorts, and just said, "Well, we have to go," and she just laughed and went with it. I was in shock, but other than it being strange to have hairy man legs in my wedding photos, taking the pictures was really fun, and they were totally relaxed. I'm pretty sure they will be doing well. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. See you in the next video.